Parts of the Great Salt Lake are almost 10 times saltier than the ocean. So that may lead you to believe that nothing could survive in this unique water that also makes you float. But that's where you'd be wrong. The Great Salt Lake is home to tiny brine shrimp, which actually create a multi-million-dollar industry that many have no idea exists right here along the Wasatch Front. This is Wild, a Utah Division of Wildlife Resources podcast. I'm your host, Faith Heaton Jolly, and this is episode 15, Great Salt Lake Gold. Welcome back to Wild, everyone. We are excited to do today's episode. At least I am. Maybe my guests are not quite as enthusiastic about this. So in studio today, I have with me John Luft. He is our Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program Manager. Say that 5 times fast.
Good luck.
It's a mouthful. And then we have Trevor Doman. He is one of our conservation officers with the division. Thanks for coming on today, you guys.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking us.
This is great, yeah. And as usual, we're a little like Darth Vader with our mask going on here breathing, so bear with us.
Yeah, I thought when you said mask, that's why I came in a Batman mask, so this was different. I forgot about the COVID.
He's celebrating Halloween early.
Right.
How long have you each been with the division?
I've been working for the division for about 26 years.
Oh, wow.
And then on the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, I was the avian biologist for several years and have been the program manager since 2007, I believe.
Okay. And talk about kind of what you do.
Yeah, so we manage the brine shrimp fishery out on Great Salt Lake, as well as monitor birds, mostly the non-game birds, and do the management for the waterfowl management areas too.
Gotcha. So just all things to do with Great Salt Lake.
Exactly.
You're researching it and studying it, yeah. Which is a lot.
It is
a man
comprehensive.
Man of many talents over here. And then Trevor, how long have you been with the division?
I've been with the division now about 6 years, a little over 6 years.
Okay. And talk about what are you doing day to day as a conservation officer?
Yeah, so conservation officer is our title, and also known as game wardens, if you're old school, that's what we like to do. So our jobs are to enforce and watch over and protect our wildlife. Part of what we're talking about today is a wildlife not a lot of people know about. So,
yes, yeah. Exactly. This is a more unique side of your job.
Very much so.
People think of you like checking fishing licenses, and this is not that.
Yeah. I definitely spend more time in the mountains and on the streams, lakes, and fisheries than I do on the Great Salt Lake, but this is an important ecosystem. So.
Yeah, no, it's super unique. So that's kind of why I'd wanted to talk about this today. So let's start off talking about what are brine shrimp? What do they look like? How big are they? What do they eat?
Yeah, so brine shrimp are much smaller than the table shrimp that we would eat. They're about a half-inch long when they're an adult.
You're not going to be finding these at restaurants anytime soon.
No, mostly because they won't fit on the skewers. So you won't be eating those. What they eat is algae or phytoplankton. I can even go through the life cycle at some point so you can kind of get an understanding of what they do throughout the season. But
yeah.
They're absolutely different than the shrimp we would eat.
And what color are they? Could you see them?
They're basically transparent, but you can see them when they're in the adult stage. The brine shrimp eggs, or cysts that we call them, actually about 50 of them would fit on the head of a pin, so they're extremely small.
So you can't see those with your naked eye.
You're going to have a microscope.
Okay. But if somebody's like swimming at the Great Salt Lake, they could possibly see an adult brine shrimp.
Definitely.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so kind of you'd mentioned this, but go into kind of, what is their life cycle? Like how long do they typically live for?
I'll just start by telling you that every brine shrimp dies every year. There is no brine shrimp in the lake in the wintertime. They either freeze to death or they just run out of food. But usually in about December time frame, we have no brine shrimp on the lake. The only thing that's left is the cysts or the eggs that they produce. About March, the water temperature starts to warm up. We get fresh water inflow, and that starts the hatching process. So the eggs that are left over, and just to give you an idea of what the brine shrimp harvest is about, it's only about harvesting the eggs, not the adults. So,
Which is interesting. Yeah.
right, yeah. So, and when I say the size of a, microscopic, it's hard to understand how you could actually harvest those, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So in March, they typically hatch out, and then we kind of divide the brine shrimp into categorize them in different life stages. We have the eggs or cysts. Then you have the smallest life stage, which is the nauplii. And then they graduate up to juvenile and ultimately adults. And our brine shrimp are a little different than some other brine shrimp around the world, which there's both male and females because they reproduce sexually. So you can distinguish males and females. And not only that, but they have a couple different modes of giving birth. So in good conditions, like I said, they eat algae or phytoplankton. For the most part, in the winter, that phytoplankton will boom because there's no brine shrimp there to consume it. So you'll see the lake, it looks like a pea green color, murky. But as soon as they hatch out...
And that's because of the algae.
Right, exactly. And so after the brine shrimp hatch out, they're consuming that algae. They'll grow into numbers so extensive that you basically will have them grazing off all of that algae, and the water basically becomes clear. So they're pretty efficient feeders. The other interesting thing about our brine shrimp is they can reproduce two different ways. They can give live birth, which is directly in their egg sacs. They'll produce nauplii, and that's when conditions are really good. When there's a lot of algae in the water, they'll have live young. As they start to get stressed, they produce these cysts or eggs. They can do either one, and I like to kind of equate brine shrimp to a cow in a pasture. So the brine shrimp would be the cow, and basically the grass in the pasture is like the algae. And at a certain point, if you put so many cows in the pasture, they're going to graze it down to nothing and then start starving to death. And essentially, it's the same way with brine shrimp. As they graze it down, they start to become stressed. They produce those cysts, and that's what carries the population into the following year.
Because that's the only thing that will survive the cold weather.
Yes, the cysts are the only thing that's left in the lake in the winter, which is what we manage and what the brine shrimp harvesters are looking to harvest.
I see. So they're really only living like 6 months, like March to December-ish.
Right. Well, it's basically what happens is as they hatch out, and usually a brine shrimp will mature after about a month or so to where they can start reproducing. A female can give birth to up to 300 eggs or nauplii.
Oh, gosh.
And they can do that about every 4 days. So
wow.
You can see how productive they can be once they're hatched out and reach adulthood.
Oh, man. I was about to say, I'm pregnant right now, and that sounds terrible.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Everything you just said sounds like my nightmare.
Yeah.
She's basically giving birth like every 4 days to hundreds of...
Exactly.
Yeah, that's terrible.
and with these brine shrimp, like I said, they'll graze the algae down to nothing, and then you'll have a huge crash in the population. So you see these big kind of generational peaks that follow that phytoplankton. And typically between March and December, we're looking at 3 to 4 generations. And that's kind of what our research has shown us, helps us understand as those populations fluctuate, we're able to understand where the generations are and what the production of the brine shrimp are going to be.
I see. So one is typically not going to last that long. They're usually cycling through.
Yeah, they can last a few months.
Okay, interesting. And so you'd kind of touched on this with the cow in the pasture analogy of they're kind of helping keep some of those algae populations in check as well. What are some other ways that they benefit the ecosystem in the Great Salt Lake?
Well, obviously, the biggest thing for us is they provide huge food source for birds. And I'll
Oh,
just give you a quick example of one species of bird, which is the eared grebe.
is
They,
that the one that people always call seagulls?
no,
Okay.
they're,
It's the one that people always shoot as a duck, but it's not a duck.
Oh, no.
yeah, they might
Yeah, says our law enforcement officer that sees this every day.
they might be called hell divers occasionally. So
Interesting.
yeah, and these birds, when they come to Great Salt Lake, usually in the fall, they spend most of the fall season here at least when the brine shrimp are alive. So they'll show up in late August, September, and then stay until the brine shrimp are all dead. And they feed exclusively on brine shrimp when they're here. 100% of their diet is brine shrimp. Not only that, but they become flightless. They molt when they're here. And so if the food isn't available to them, it's extremely risky for that population.
So they would basically starve to death if there's not enough brine
exactly
shrimp.
right, because they don't have any other food source that's available to them.
Interesting.
And usually, I mean, in years past, we've had typically about half of the entire eared grebe population winters at Great Salt Lake.
Oh, wow.
The other
The world's population.
Right,
Oh,
right,
wow.
or North American population.
Okay.
The other half would usually go to Mona Lake in California. Probably a couple decades ago, we would get about 1 million eared grebes. That's one species of bird relying exclusively on brine shrimp. But conditions at Mona Lake started to suffer, and the food source there started to dry up a little bit. So most of the eared grebes started coming to Great Salt Lake. So the last probably decade or so, we've had averaging probably about 4 million eared grebes per year. Sometimes our counts go over 5 million. So you can imagine that's a lot of birds that are relying on brine shrimp. And part of the research that we've done is to run an energetic study on how many brine shrimp it takes these eared grebes per day to survive, and found that it's between 25 and 30,000 brine shrimp per day.
Wow.
So you can imagine what kind of consumption that is for each one. 5 million eared grebes eating 25 to 30,000 brine shrimp
That's
a
a
day.
lot of
when
brine
they're here.
shrimp.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I've talked to you about this previously too. It's not just the eared grebes, right? There's a lot of different bird species that rely on these brine shrimp as feed.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we have the largest breeding population of California gulls here, and they rely on brine shrimp when they're not eating French fries in a parking lot, at least. And multiple other bird species. There's some waterfowl species like green-winged teal, shovelers, and also go out on the lake when other sources of food dry up. Brine shrimp, in the salt water, they're difficult for birds to acclimate to that high salinity and then process. Brine shrimp are mostly water, so
They're still getting a lot of salt when they're eating them.
and they're not that nutritious. It just takes a long time or a lot of brine shrimp to make a good meal.
I see. And since you'd kind of touched on this, I guess brine shrimp are kind of the only living thing that can handle that much salt, right?
There's two types of zooplankton in the Great Salt Lake, and brine shrimp are one, and then brine flies are the other. And brine flies are not harvested or regulated, but
that's what people just complain about when they go visit.
And brine flies don't bite you; they mostly spend their time just buzzing around and getting in your face.
Right. And so, kind of talk a little bit about. I mean, you've mentioned some of this, how we research and manage these brine shrimp. Like, how do we know how many there are? And how do we kind of estimate that?
Right. So we mostly manage the commercial brine shrimp harvest. So it started probably back or got into full swing in the early 90s. Brine shrimp have been harvested probably since the 50s or so.
From the Great Salt Lake.
Right. But back then they were mostly utilized for ornamental fish feeding, your aquarium fish, or sea monkeys, of course, which is why I'm the sea monkey biologist, which is the more glamorous term, I guess, than brine shrimp biologist. At that time, there wasn't a demand for brine shrimp as big as it is now, and basically the reason for that is the aquaculture, global aquaculture industry around the world took off. Back in the 80s, you would have, most of the shrimp that we would eat would be shrimp caught out of the ocean.
Sure.
Now, over half of the shrimp that we would eat is grown in these aquaculture facilities.
Little farm type things.
Right,
Interesting.
yeah. And so ultimately what brine shrimp are used for is the larval stages of the table shrimp that you and I would eat. Table shrimp are basically a predator. They have this innate desire to catch and eat their food. You can't just dump manufactured feed in for them to eat. So in their larval stage, they have to pursue and catch their food. And so that's exactly what brine shrimp are used for. So you have these brine shrimp harvesters will dry these cysts, the eggs, dump those into the water where these table shrimp are. They'll hatch within 72 hours, and the little nauplii will start swimming around, and that's what the table shrimp start eating. And they need them for the first few weeks of their life, and then they can convert over to a manufactured feed. So
they're food for our food basically.
Basically. So in a roundabout way, we are eating brine shrimp after we're eating the shrimp that has consumed them. So to get to your question about what we do as far as monitoring, back in the early 90s, this aquaculture industry started taking off, and more people came to Great Salt Lake to harvest the brine shrimp because they saw the demand globally going up.
Everybody likes shrimp,
right?
You know?
Yeah, and so there was a lot of fishermen that came in to essentially exploit the resource that we had, and it was pretty easy to get a permit, which is a COR, a certificate of registration. That's what's needed to harvest the brine shrimp. And so at the time, people were just coming in because it was a huge lucrative business. And interestingly, the brine shrimpers realized that if they weren't careful, they would overexploit the resource.
Sure.
And so they asked to be regulated and policed, which is what Trevor does.
Which is super cool if you think about it.
And it is a unique cooperative relationship, basically. They asked to be regulated. I don't know how many times you get people asking you.
Can you limit the amount of deer I can harvest this year?
Yeah, exactly. Or tell me not to catch this many fish or whatever.
Sure.
So they asked to be regulated, but also to do the research on understanding the system because we didn't know anything about it.
And I guess that's where you came in.
That's exactly where the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program took off.
That's awesome.
Basically being asked by the industry to get started, do the research, and then also be policed on the lake. And so that's exactly what we did. And through that, we found that we monitor the harvest. Now, most commercial fisheries, the reason that they crash or have problems is you overharvest.
Sure.
Well, that's what they were worried about. And through our research, we found that you can overharvest as well as underharvest. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but basically when those brine shrimp, and I'll kind of explain, it's kind of obvious that you can overharvest a system because then there's not enough left for the following generation or to start the next generation. But you can underharvest. So when I mentioned they all hatch out in March, if there's too many left over, they hatch out, and as I explained, there was you have nauplii juveniles, adults. Well, those nauplii all hatch out. They're not the reproducers, but they're the consumers of that algae.
I see.
And they won't reach adulthood because they eat it too quick and reduce the algae that are there before they reach adulthood,
So
which is the
they
reproduction.
starve to death before they can have
exactly
babies.
before they hit adulthood.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then you'll have the generations oscillate at a low level and not be as productive. And our goal is to try to make sure that the brine shrimp industry is able to harvest. We actually utilize them just like we use hunters to manage our big game populations. We want them to hit that optimal level of harvest so that the following year we have the best production. And that seems to have worked. I mean, like I said, we used to have 1 million eared grebes and now about 5 million. So they're happy, and I guess eating 25 to 30,000 shrimp, we're probably the inventors of the all-you-can-eat shrimp buffet. So because of the research and because of the management, it's worked out really well, and the cooperation with the industry,
Sure.
which is unique as well.
And I know in kind of doing this research, you guys will do like weekly patrols on boats and by plane. Talk about how that kind of works.
Yeah, so every week we go out, and as I mentioned, a lot of commercial fisheries are done by creating a quota where you can only harvest this many. It's different here at Great Salt Lake, where they can harvest as much as they want. We monitor the brine shrimp throughout the season, and once they deplete it to that optimal level, we shut the season down. So they can harvest as much as they want throughout the season. And then once we hit that optimal level, we shut things down, and that maximizes the productivity for the following year.
What's typically the season for these harvesters to come out?
Right. So the brine shrimp season starts October 1st, and it runs through the end of January, unless we shut it down sooner, which we've done many times. And we've also extended the season past January 31st just because we hadn't reached the numbers that we wanted to.
Gotcha. Interesting. So, and when you're doing the flights, like what are you looking for when you do those?
Right. So some of that has to do with law enforcement. So there are certain things that Trevor's looking for as far as making sure that these harvesters aren't interfering with other harvesters. And it used to be a lot more contentious when there was so many companies out there. Essentially, brine shrimp were called Great Salt Lake Gold, and the cysts kind of formed streaks that look like gold. So,
and you said they kind of look like oil slicks, right?
Exactly.
On the top of the water.
Exactly. And that's how they harvest. Those cysts will form kind of slicks, which ultimately they spot from the air, which I can also spot from the air when I'm doing those patrols. But you can see these slicks. They'll radio down to their boats. Those boats will come, and because they look like oil slicks, that's exactly how they harvest it. They put oil containment boom around those big streaks of brine shrimp eggs and then pump out the cysts into a semi-permeable sack, which drains the water out, and you're left with a bunch of brine shrimp eggs.
Interesting.
Tiny little specks.
Tiny specks that are worth a lot of money, yeah.
Hence brings in some law enforcement applications right there, because that's when John said it becomes very competitive to get to that streak first, because the first boat to there can establish that streak as their streak. And if they beat the other company or the other organization there first, it's their streak. Therefore, they have, like John said, speeders, different boats that just fly very fast with a lot of power on them, multiple outboards. Some of their boats that are probably worth $500,000 that are just their speeders alone. They go fast.
Yeah.
They get there real quick to be able to throw their COR marker on that cyst to claim it as theirs. And then comes their harvest boat as they begin to harvest on that. But again, it's the first company there, is the first one to market, that becomes theirs. And then they have certain rules and regulations. They can only be so many feet from their boat with their boom to capture that, and no one can set up or encroach on them up to a certain distance. And sometimes that gets very competitive, especially if the streak is big and both of the companies show up and they're both trying to catch some of the streak, and they get into arguments and get into fights back and forth. Those are kind of the interesting things that we've seen, and law enforcement is called on it because it becomes very competitive, because the brine shrimp eggs become very valuable once they're harvested.
Interesting. Basically, they have to stay at that spot that they've kind of claimed as theirs until they've harvested all those eggs.
They don't have to, but they do, because that's what their goal is to harvest them. So they'll get there, they'll claim it, their boat will show up to begin the harvesting. They'll deploy their boom, they'll circle up all the eggs, they'll bring them in, then they'll suck them up, put them on the deck in these big bags, and then once that slick has been cleaned, then they'll up and move to another site.
Is it kind of the same as like our deer hunting season, that there's certain hours, like they can't start until, it's light and they have to be done before dark, or could they go all night?
They actually can go all night long, I guess. There is no regulation stating that it's sun up to sundown or anything, yeah.
Interesting.
Once that season's open, they can harvest 24 hours a day if they want, as long as they have that COR present at the site.
And we'd kind of mentioned that. John had talked about that as well. What does somebody have to do if they say, you know what, I want to get involved in this? Kind of what do they need to do to get a COR?
Just an application process through the division that you would go forward to be able to get it. There's really just two organizations right now that are in competition with each other on the Great Salt Lake. One is OSI and the other one is the co-op. And
I see.
They both have multiple CORs. The co-op is a little larger than OSI with a few more CORs issued to them. But those are the two that are in competition really with each other. So I think not only just filling out a COR, but you would have to have a lot of money to invest in all the equipment, because they, like John was saying, John flies planes and watches for stuff, but they also have planes that they'll get up and they'll have persons in the planes looking for these slicks. They'll radio to the speeders where the slick is. The speeder runs out to the slicks as fast as they can, before the harvester can, get there. The slicks claim their spot. But it's again, both companies have planes, both of them sending speeders, and whoever gets to the slick the first gets to claim it. So it's very competitive.
That's so interesting. It's like a literal gold rush kind of.
Yeah, it kind of is. Yeah.
That's amazing. And so talk about your patrols. Like, how often are you doing these during the season?
Really, the two companies work together pretty gosh darn good. We don't have a whole heck of a lot of issues. Every year, once in a while, something happens. But we go out on the lake on multiple patrols on the boats, where we'll go out and stop and check and make sure that they've got all the numbers correct and the letters on the boats correct and CORs are present and everybody has helper cards and everything's registered correctly and they've got life jackets and fire extinguishers and so forth.
It's like license checks as well as like safety.
Yeah. And we'll also do shore patrols, because not only do they harvest from boats, but they also have on that backside of the Great Salt Lake on the west side there, they'll have setups where they'll have their helpers out and they'll be raking the sand, because the brine share, the eggs will float to shore, and so as they land on the shore they'll just be raking them up, and they need to have a COR also on the shore with them, and then they can harvest the same distance they can from a boom but on the shore from each COR. So you'll have guys out on the shore raking up the eggs and harvesting them, putting them in buckets also.
Okay, so you're doing both the boats and walking on the shore.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And I kind of mentioned to you guys before, I actually got to go on one of these law enforcement patrols when I worked at KSL. And it was really cool. It was in January and it was freezing. I do remember that. It was really cold while we were kind of driving around looking for boats. And do you guys typically, do they have to report where they are on the lake, or do you kind of just drive your boat until you find them?
We usually jump in with a harbor master out of Great Salt Lake that works for the DNR, and he has really good communications with him. He also has a setup that pretty much tells him where they're at on the lake. A nice little, I guess it's a sonar system that tells him where, I don't know, it's radar, sonar, I don't know what he uses, but he can see where the boats are as he's out running around the lake, and then visually just look. He knows where the most of the harvesting takes place. And they have areas of the Great Salt Lake that are actually shut off and they can't go to. So we'll go out into the areas where they're allowed to harvest, and then you can just physically just see them, and we'll engage in that.
And what would cause like certain areas to be closed off to the harvest?
To be more John's question there.
Yeah, so, and there has been points that, like I said, the population was too low and we've shut the season down. There was a year that we only allowed them to harvest in the north arm of the Great Salt Lake. Then there's all of the bays are closed, like Ogden Bay, Farmington Bay, Bear River Bay, where they're not allowed to go. And then there's...
Is that just because there's a lot of people that use those areas?
Yeah, and honestly, there isn't a lot of brine shrimp that would be available there, but that's more set aside for birds, so the birds aren't disturbed from this shore harvest that might occur there,
Gotcha.
And hunters as well.
Okay. And so you guys, I mean, you've both obviously been doing this for a while. Trevor, I guess, what are some unique, interesting experiences that you've had since you've been doing some of these law enforcement patrols?
The only thing I've really come across that's been interesting, I think, is the arguments or disputes the boaters between the two companies have got into. We'll stop at a boat and begin to talk to them and check them, and they'll start complaining and telling us how the encroachment of the other company got too close and some of the gestures and so forth that they did to the other company, and how they're upset with them because they were encroaching on their COR marker of the things, and real upset about it. But other than that, most of it's pretty gosh darn good. I really haven't experienced too much myself in the applications that we've gone through that have really shocked me.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's good. And yeah, John, what are some kind of interesting things that you've experienced since you've been doing the research out here?
Yeah, so most of the things that I guess would be interesting is probably how many times I've almost died out there. So I've almost sunk virtually every kind of boat, and we have multiple different kinds of boats. We have John boats, layout boats, airboats, and then our big research vessels. And I've probably almost sunk in every single one of those. I probably hold the record. As Trevor was saying, we rely on the harbor master out there, and he's probably pulled me off the lake multiple times, so I probably have a record for that. I can remember one time when we were out doing research and I had the student with me, and we were on an airboat, and the alternator fell off.
Oh,
and
geez.
I'm not a mechanically inclined person. We'll just say that. I can barely change the oil in anything, although a lot of people call me dipstick a lot of times. But I don't do very well with that kind of stuff. There was no waterfowl season. There was nobody out on the lake at the time. We didn't have reception. We couldn't call anybody. And he was worried that we wouldn't get off the lake. And
he's like, this is where we're going to die.
And I thought the same. I'm like, well, maybe we can walk out of here, because we were in fairly shallow water that we could have got out in waders. But we're talking miles of walking and abandoning the boat. But I was able to tie on the alternator. So the bolt holding the alternator in broke off. And so I tied it back on with some nylon cord. And he was like, what? There's no way that's working. And I'm like, well, I don't know what else to do. Ended up tying that on there, starting it up. And I was like, well, it's running. Maybe we can make. And we limped our way back in, and the whole time we're shaking our heads, when is this going to just go,
right.
you know? But we managed to get back and survive. So, I mean, things like that. And I also, I mean, not just on boats, but I skipped off the water once in the airplane when we were doing a survey, when conditions got a little hazy out there. Sorry, our pilot probably doesn't want me telling you that.
I know. I'm like, we'll pretend like the leadership isn't hearing any of this.
Yeah, there's been a lot of sketchy calls, I guess, as far as that goes. But maybe instead of focusing on some of the negative stuff, I'll focus on kind of a cool story when I went out with our director and our DNR director, our DWR director and the DNR director, to go look at the breach in the causeway. It had been closed, the north and south arm, and there was about a 3 to 4 foot head difference between the two arms, and they opened up a bridge, built a bridge and opened it up, and there was so much water going through there. I mean, I don't know anything about category rapids or whatever, but we went to look at that. It was so impressive, the amount of water going through there.
Oh, wow.
And everybody wanted to kind of take a look at that. However, the DNR director at the time, Mike Styler, said as we were coming back, he was like, and I mentioned the number of eared grebes. You have 5 million eared grebes. We are driving for miles through just the thickest concentrations of these eared grebes. And they were starting to get congregated to where they were going to take off and head south, because it was late in the winter. And you can literally see them on radar when they take off, and they fly at night, and so there's hundreds of thousands of birds that go at the same time, and so there's these huge blobs on radar that you can follow them out. Anyway, we're driving through all these, and he said, you know, that water that going through the causeway, that's impressive. But he goes, I feel like I could step out of this boat and walk for miles on the back of these grebes. There's
Wow.
so many of them. And he goes, that's more impressive to me. And that just kind of emphasizes the productivity of the lake. And like I said, they eat 25 to 30,000 brine shrimp. One of the biologists did a calculation one time at our typical brine shrimp numbers. He said the equivalent, and I mean, brine shrimp are so small, they weigh almost nothing. But he said the number of brine shrimp in the lake would be the equivalent of 13,500 bull African elephants.
Oh, wow.
And so I started thinking, well, what is the old saying is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Sure.
One bite of brine shrimp size at a time. So how many of these elephants made out of brine shrimp are these eared grebes eating? So
That's super impressive. And yeah, just on the couple of times I've got to go on boat rides out there, it is such a unique place and kind of a cool ecosystem. So yeah, I really appreciate you guys coming on and kind of talking about some of your work surrounding this industry and just kind of educating us on how interesting it is. And as always, if you haven't subscribed to the Wild Podcast, we'd love if you could do that. You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, as well as on the DWR website. And we hope that you'll join us next month for some more wildlife stories.